Hey class, today we're going to talk about how Europe centralized its powers, particularly France and Russia, centralized their power in the wake of the wars of religion and strengthened the state by so doing. This discussion then we'll call European absolutism. Of course, it's a fair question to ask what it is. This is the idea that the sovereign authority or powers of a state are in the hands of a king who rules by divine right. The divine right of kings is just what it sounds like, that the sovereign authority to rule comes from God. The power to make laws, the power to tax, the power to administer justice, conduct foreign policy, and in general, control the state bureaucracy and do things come from God. And the authority of the king is derived from God's power that the God had designated. And this is likewise true in France. This is the royal standard of the Bourbon family, and we'll meet them momentarily. The chief theorist of absolutism in France was this guy, Bishop Jacques Bossuet. And he argued that government came from God, so humans could live in an organized society, much like God's kingdom was organized with God as the monarch. And that monarchy was thus the most natural form of government because that's how God ruled. God had established kings to rule all the people. And that the king received their power from God, so their authority was absolute. That meant that they didn't have to answer to a parliament or some sort of legislative body. They didn't have to answer to the people, that the people's interest were the king's interest. The only person or thing or entity that the king had to answer to was God upon his death and judgment. Now, Bossuet also argued that a king's power was not absolute. It had the law of the church above it. That all kings were subject to the law of God. Of course, the Ten Commandments are an example of those laws, that even kings had to follow the law of God. Now, I'm sure you're sensing some tension still existing between the secular government of kings and the sacred rules of the church that have been around since the medieval era. So let's see how that worked in France. Henry IV, the Edict of Nantes guy that we talked about during the Wars of Religion, the guy that issued the Edict of Nantes, died in 1610. His child was a baby. And of course, he was the first king of the Bourbon family. His son, Louis, becomes king and is named Louis XIII. He's the 13th Louis to hold the title of King of France. Now, of course, he can't exercise power. He is in his minority. So his regent, the regent appointed, is Cardinal Richelieu. Richelieu is probably the most famous cardinal in history. He is a French patriot. He wants to see the power of France increase. And of course, since he's practicing the power of the Kingdom of France, in the name of the king, his power also increases. So he moved to increase the power of the Bourbon family. And there's three primary places that he moved against. He moved against the Huguenots. The Huguenots, the French Protestants, had established their own cities following the Edict of Nantes, for which they were allowed. And they allied themselves with Protestant nobles. Well, they rebelled against Louis XIII and were quickly crushed. And basically what Richelieu said was, we're just going to put in one modification to the Edict of Nantes. You can continue having your cities. You can continue practicing your religion, Protestants. You just can't have walls around your cities. Now, I'd like you to put down on the sheet or on the Google doc why that was significant, why Richelieu's order that no Huguenot cities could have walls around them was important. I'll wait. Okay, let's keep going. Now, the nobility was a second group against whom Richelieu acted to centralize power of the Bourbons. And basically, what he did with the nobility was to say, look, if the king didn't authorize you to have a castle, which of course was the primary means by which nobility kept their power independent of the king, by holding a castle, then the cardinal said, you must destroy your own castle, or we will destroy it for you. So if the nobility destroyed their own castles, they weakened themselves. If they rebelled against the king, then the king's army would descend upon them, destroy the castle, and the nobleman lost his power. In either event, they lost their power. He also increased taxes on the nobility, which also further weakened them. Finally, the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs were the natural enemy of France. If you'll recall, the Habsburgs were both the Austrian Habsburgs and the Spanish Habsburgs. They're two branches of the same family. And Richelieu challenged their power and further centralized the state by engaging in the 30 Years' War, what would become the 30 Years' War, playing both sides against the Habsburgs. France was on the Protestant side sometimes, then they switched over to the Catholic side. Whatever weakened the Habsburgs more is the side that they took. Now, Louis XIII eventually dies, as does Richelieu, and Louis XIII dies in 1643. He's succeeded by his son, funny enough, Louis XIV, who's only 5 years old. Thus, his mother becomes regent. And another cardinal works his way into power as the chief advisor. This is Cardinal Mazarin. Mazarin was a rogue. He was a gambler. He was a ladies' man. There's rumors that he was the lover of the queen for a little while. Regardless, he wheedled his way into power, and Louis XIV only took power after Cardinal Mazarin died. Louis XIV was, about 18 at the time, and this is a picture of Louis XIV at that time. He referred to himself as the Sun King, which should give you some indication of this guy's self-regard. He acted similarly to centralize power to himself, following in the footsteps of Richelieu. He did so by a couple matters. The nobility was still testing to see if this young king was going to be a powerful man or somebody they could take advantage of. Louis acted to exclude nobility from his councils. So rather, he only accepted advice and posted as governing officials commoners, French commoners. For a number of reasons. One, he put down in his journal, because he could boss them around. I mean, in his councils, and we know this because he kept journals and wrote this kind of stuff down. He recorded at one point that he had decided that morning, before he went to hear from his privy council, that he was going to say no to every proposal. Not having heard them, whether they were good ideas or not, he was going to say no because he was the Sun King. He had the power. And so that's what he did. He also increased the power of the bureaucracy, which was primarily staffed by commoners as well, the intendant. These guys spied on other people for him. They were also bureaucrats. They also further extended the power of the king through his government. He had built his magnificent palace, Versailles, outside of Paris, and he required all the nobility to move. This is about 3,000-4,000 nobility to move to Versailles full time, where they would pay him rent to stay in rooms in the various spaces built for them. They also had to support themselves, paying the state money for food and everything else. Now, he wanted them nearby so he could keep an eye on them, but he was also doing this to limit their power. Jean-Baptiste Colbert was the commoner who was put in charge of the Ministry of Finance. He was a mercantilist, and we've already talked about mercantilism, this idea that colonies allowed a state to become more self-sufficient, and so there was a big push internationally for the French to develop the sugar islands in the Caribbean. Guadeloupe and other islands in the Caribbean proved to be a big boon for the French economy. Now, there was also a period, the war years of Louis XIV. His overriding concern was to bring glory and power to France and himself, because he didn't see a difference between France and himself. He's very famously said, I am the state. Le toi et moi. The state is me. So how was this exemplified? Well, he went to war to kind of straighten out the French border. He went to war several times against the Habsburgs and other Protestant states. He went against the Spanish Netherlands, the Dutch Netherlands, to try to straighten out that northeast border of France. And this really spooked the larger European community. All the other states and the leaders of these countries kind of panicked because France was a powerful state. And they formed what's called the League of Augsburg in 1689. The primary states, the Austrians, the Prussians, the British, and the Dutch come together in an alliance against France. And so they were attempting to maintain a balance of power in Europe, a balance between everybody else and France. And they fought back against the French to contain it. Now, France by this time had been fighting wars for a couple decades. They had had a couple bad harvests. And so France accepted a treaty limiting themselves to their limiting, or I shouldn't say limiting, but consolidating their gains. And things kind of quieted out for about a decade until 1701. Louis XIV at this point is in his 60s, and his grandson Philip becomes King of Spain. Now, Philip is a very young man. He's a boy. And here's the thing. Because he was a direct heir, there was an outside chance that Philip could have unified the Spanish and French thrones under one crown. This would have made a single king over all the territory of Spain and France. The rest of Europe completely panicked and declared war on France and Spain. This is the so-called War of the Spanish Succession. It lasted 13 years. The French and Spanish versus England, Austria, the Dutch, and the Portuguese. Now there's a lot of fighting, a lot of killing, a lot of dying, and it ends with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1714. And basically the agreement is, and tens of thousands of people died. Colonies changed hands. The fighting was fierce in the New World as much as it was in the Old, in Europe. Basically, the Treaty of Utrecht ends the fighting and says, okay, we're going to trade some colonies back and forth, but really, here's the most important thing. Philip, you can keep your throne in Spain, but there will never be a unification of France and Spain. Even if you could, you won't be allowed to, and they agreed to that. Now, the big winner out of all this was Great Britain. They pick up a bunch of French colonies, and their trade expands, so of course their revenues expand. Now, this gets us to the cusp of the Enlightenment, so we're going to step away. But at this point, France is a centralized state, a lot of power in the hands of the king, and those people that the king favors. And we're going to stop there today. See you guys in class.